Okay, here we are. So yesterday we began to, we moved over from the mitzvah of building a sukkah to the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah. And we saw there was a lot to know regarding the significance of building a sukkah, and there's a whole lot more to know about the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah. And sitting in the mitzvah of a sukkah is much more than just making a bracha or going inside for a meal. But yesterday we discussed that the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah is teishvu b'sukkah is teishvu shivas yamim. Teishvu means that you should sit, but not just sit. It means like a toshav. A toshav is a residence. For 7 days we should reside in the sukkah, which means that just however we would live the rest of the year, that's how we live in the sukkah. And he gives a number of examples, just to recap what we did, that you should bring in all of your fancy tableware, your crockery and your dishes, and to really make it an honorable, to do it not like it's not just like a picnic, but as if you're home in your own comfortable space, eating there, drinking there, learning there, resting or matayal. Usually that would mean to go on for a walk. I don't know how much of a walk you could do in your sukkah, but I guess it means going out to relax, sleeping in the sukkah. Even if you need to chat with a friend, you have a phone call to make that phone call in the sukkah. Similarly, if you're davening and you're not davening at shul, to do so dafka in the sukkah. So we see over here that the sukkah is more than just a place to eat, but it's a place that we live. Moshe, good to have you back. Missed you yesterday. That was the first point that we mentioned, and then we discussed how part of the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah is to know why we're sitting in the sukkah. Most mitzvahs, once you do the mitzvah is done. The reasons behind the mitzvah are secondary. But when it comes to the sukkah, the Torah clearly says, Lama'an yetu doreisechem, in order that the future generations know that I took you out of Egypt. So when we sit in the sukkah, we should have in mind that the reason we are sitting in the sukkah is to remember how Hashem protected us with the sukkah that was made out of clouds, the clouds of glory when we came out of Egypt. And that's why we're sitting in the sukkah, to remember how Hashem protects us and looks after us. Now, the obvious question would come up, if the sukkah is about the exodus from Egypt, then surely we should have our Seder in the sukkah. So the Kitzur brings from, I think it's a Medrash, that says that the reason why Hashem tells us to sit in the sukkah in the 7th month, not the first month when we went out of Egypt, if we're counting from Nisan, was to make it clear that we're not sitting in the sukkah out of convenience, but rather specifically when everybody is leaving their outdoor spaces. In the northern hemisphere, it's starting to get cold and starting to rain, in Johannesburg as well. That's specifically when we go into our sukkah, to make it clear that we're sitting in the sukkah not out of personal benefit, but rather so that we can remind ourselves of the miracle that Hashem performed for us. Okay, so that is about the sukkah, the mitzvah of sitting in sukkah in general. Now let's talk about the first. So in some of the other classes, we've discussed that there are 2 types of mitzvahs. There are some mitzvahs that a person must do. There are other mitzvahs that are circumstantial. We have what's called a chiyuv gavra, like gever, and chiyuv chefza, like chafetz, a chayfetz, an item. There are some mitzvahs that are incumbent upon the person. There are other mitzvahs that are incumbent upon a person that has a specific chayfetz, a specific article, a person that has something in place. So just to give an example, the Torah says, "Va'asita maka lagagecha," you should make a fence for your roof. It doesn't mean you have to build a roof to make a fence. It means if you have a roof, then make a fence. So when it comes to the mitzvah of sukkah, there's a difference between the first night and the rest of the other 6 or 7 days. The first day of Sukkot, the mitzvah isn't just if you need to eat, then go and do that in the sukkah. On the first night, there is a mitzvah to go and eat in the sukkah. So even if a person says, no, I'm not going to eat at all, I'm not hungry, it doesn't really work because you need to make kiddush. But if for whatever reason a person wasn't making kiddush, you'd say, okay, well, if I'm not eating or drinking anything, then I don't need to be in the sukkah. Although we did say that everything should be done in the sukkah. But the point that I'm making is that on the first night, it's not just that when you are living, you should live in the sukkah. The first night, one makes a point of specifically being in a sukkah. That's when it's a mitzvah. That's a chiyuv gavra. It's an obligation on the person for him to go after, as opposed to the remaining 6 or 7 days. Then it's, if you're eating, then it has to be done in the sukkah. If you're sleeping, unless it's cold or dangerous, or you're worried that you won't be dressed appropriately, then that needs to be done in the sukkah. Let's see this inside. Eating in the sukkah on the first night of Sukkot is an obligation. It is required that you eat in the sukkah not less than a kazayas. A kazayas, according to some halachic authorities, is approximately 27 grams, which is about a slice of bread, like a slice of challah, not just a few crumbs. Even if you suffer discomfort, you are obligated to eat in the sukkah. However, if it rains, as we'll discuss soon, and it seems that it will stop in an hour or two, you should wait and then make kiddush and eat in the sukkah in the appropriate way. But if it appears that the rain is not stopping, or you waited and it did not stop, then you should say the kiddush in the sukkah and say shechiyano, and have in mind when saying shechiyano that this bracha also applies to the sukkah, but you should not say leishev basukkah. Let's discuss this. So when it rains, then you don't have to eat in the sukkah. Why? Because even in your house, if your geyser bursts and you're having a waterfall in your bedroom, then you don't know, you're not going to sleep there, you'll move out. So if it's raining, then it's no longer a way of living. So since it's not a way of living, so when it rains, there's no obligation to eat in the sukkah. Now the question though is, can you fulfill the mitzvah? So there are different opinions on this. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch actually says that since according to some authorities, when it's raining, that's not the way of living. So according to those authorities, you actually can't fulfill the mitzvah of eating in the sukkah when it rains. So therefore, you would eat then, according to authorities, that you are fulfilling the mitzvah in the rain, but you wouldn't make the bracha leishev basukkah, because as we've said on numerous occasions, when it comes to brachas, we have a principle: when in doubt, go without. So since according to some authorities, this wouldn't qualify as a mitzvah, you don't want to possibly be saying Hashem's name in vain. So just to summarize again, what we're saying is on the first night, it's not just that if you're eat in the sukkah, on the first night, there's an obligation to eat in the sukkah. So therefore, if you could wait an hour or two before you make kiddush, great. If not, then go ahead and make kiddush in the rain in the sukkah so that you fulfill that mitzvah. But since according to some authorities, you still have not fulfilled the mitzvah, you wouldn't say the bracha leishev basukkah. Others would, there are different opinions about this. Some say that one can make the bracha even when it's raining, one still can fulfill the mitzvah. And then you would, so according to this opinion, you wouldn't make the bracha yet. You would wash your hands, say hamatzi, eat a kazayas of bread in the sukkah without interruption, then go into your house to complete the meal. And bear in mind when washing your hands and when saying hamatzi that you intended moving, because generally wherever you say hamatzi, that's where you need to eat. If it stops raining before you bench, then go back into the sukkah and then you make the bracha leishev basukkah and eat slightly more than a kibetza of bread, which would be about double what I said before. 27 times 2 is about 54 kasesim, which would be approximately 2 slices of bread, or challah, which is heavy, maybe it would be 1 thick slice of challah. And then you would bench. If it stops raining after you benched, then meaning you started, it was raining and you couldn't wait any longer, so you made kiddush in the sukkah, according to those authorities that you can fulfill the mitzvah while it's raining. Then you went into the house to finish your meal and you benched, because when you finish eating, you have to bench right away. And then a little while later, it stopped raining. So you want to be able to now do the mitzvah according to all opinions by sitting in the sukkah also when it's not raining. So then you would return to the sukkah, and he says actually to wash again. How's that? You would say have a second meal, have more than a kibetza, which is about 2 slices of regular bread, or I would say about a slice of challah. And then you'd say the bracha leishev basukkah and then bench once again. If so, after the rain has stopped, water is still dripping from the schach in your own sukkah, then and there's another sukkah in the neighborhood which had a closed roof while it was raining, so that the schach is now dry. It's quite amazing how this is written about 100 years ago, and the way he writes, it seems like at the time it was quite common for people to have roofs that closed over the sukkahs 100 years back. I mean, today with technology, this should be like a given. should come with every sukkah that you buy. Part of the deal should be a cover, but it's interesting that it hasn't. Then you should actually go to that sukkah. So let me just summarize this once again. On the first night, there is a specific mitzvah to make sure you are in a sukkah on the first night of Sukkot. And according to some authorities, that mitzvah can only be done when it's not raining. According to other authorities, it can also be done when it is raining. So therefore, what should you do? Try wait for it to stop raining. If it doesn't stop, then eat a little bit in the rain and then go inside, finish your meal there. And if at any point it stops raining, then go back into the sukkah and eat some more and make the bracha leishav basukkah. So, I mean, it's interesting, the different customs in the Chabad community. So the tradition passed down is that one does fulfill the mitzvah even when it's raining. Then in Brisk, for example, so they are of the opinion that one does not fulfill the mitzvah when it's raining. And so those that are really dedicated and insistent and not wanting to let the mitzvah pass on the first night of Sukkot can actually end up, there are stories of brisk Jews staying up the whole night, just waiting for it to stop raining for a few minutes so that they could be able to fulfill the mitzvah without rain. Because as we said, if you want it to be a way that you live, you don't usually hang out when it's raining, you hang out where it's not raining. So it's an interesting phenomenon of people staying up on the first night of Sukkot, waiting and hoping for it to stop raining so that they can fulfill the mitzvah according to all the opinions. That's what's done in the Brisker community. Okay, that is all on the first night of Sukkot, when there is an obligation to eat at the sukkah. From once that first night is over, then it's no longer an obligation to eat at the sukkah, but rather if you are eating or if you are sleeping, again, let's talk about sleeping for a moment. Maybe I'll say it's in the kitzur, but I'll just touch on it briefly. I mean, in theory, just as one is obligated to eat and drink in the sukkah, one is obligated to sleep in the sukkah. However, in practice, the Shulchan Aruch says that for various reasons, it's customary for people not to sleep in the sukkah. What are the reasons? One reason that's brought is because it's very cold. So therefore, again, in your own house, you're not going to sleep in a place that's freezing. So since it's freezing, you're not going to be comfortable, so then you need to move inside. Obviously, that wouldn't apply to South Africa. Sometimes the weather here is beautiful. Other reasons are because it's dangerous. Maybe that could apply to South Africa. Maybe usually you're afraid to be out at night. I'm not sure. Maybe a matter of opinion. Other opinions are because when a person sleeps at night, they're not necessarily dressed appropriately. And the sukkah is a holy edifice, as we'll see soon. We already mentioned at the end of the previous chapter how even when a person is taking apart the sukkah, if it's disposable and they're throwing it away, it needs to be disposed of with respect because it was used for a mitzvah. And since there's tremendous holiness in the sukkah, you don't want to exactly be walking around there in your pajama gear. So for whatever reason, the general practice is not to sleep in the sukkah. However, since in theory it's just as much of an obligation to sleep there as to eat and drink, there are in many communities, there are many that are particular today to, yes, sleep in the sukkah. The Hasidic tradition is that because of the holiness of the sukkah and a concern of not acting to the level of holiness required for a sukkah, or when a person's sleeping, then the person is not as in control of his body for various reasons. In the Hasidic communities, the custom has become not to sleep in the sukkah because of these concerns. But I said in other communities, people are particular to sleep in the sukkah. So that's an interesting, often debated. It's even become somewhat of a controversial topic to sleep in the sukkah or not to sleep in the sukkah. Okay, on the second, that I'm sure we'll discuss it inside, but let's look back at the text. On the second night of Sukkot, it is also mandatory to eat at the sukkah. Now, the reason for that is, I said just the first night, so let me clarify. The reason we have 2 nights of Yom Tov is because we're not quite sure. Originally, we weren't quite sure which day was actually Yom Tov. It would depend on what day Rosh Chodesh was. Did witnesses come and testify to a new moon or not? So that's really for another whole shir. But the tachlis is that it was possible that the month began a day earlier or a day later. which meant that, let's say this year, it would mean that either the 15th of the month is Friday night or the 15th of the month is a day later on Motzei Shabbat. So since you wouldn't be sure which day is the 15th of the month, the Jews would actually celebrate 2 days of Yom Tov. So since the second night was established as Yom Tov, since it may still be considered the first night, so that obligation would still apply. Even if you suffer discomfort, it is governed by the same halachas that apply to the first night as we just spoke about, except for one difference. That if it appears that the rain is not going to stop, or if you waited and did not stop, you should make Kiddush in the house and eat your meal there. And before benching, you could go into the Sukkah and at least eat a kazayas in the Sukkah. So this concept of having 2 nights of Yom Tov is something that was instituted by the sages. Now, it's quite an important institution to be treated as if it's biblical. It's rabbinic, but it's treated as if it's biblical, and therefore it's the same in almost every regard, except that on the first night, you would actually make Kiddush in the rain. On the second night, you would be allowed to make Kiddush inside the house, and at some point in the meal, go outside and have a little bit of food in the sukkah if the rain is not subsiding. Okay. In the evening, on returning from the synagogue, so now let's just deal with this in a progressive order. So you've gone to shul, or if you've gone to shul, you come home, so you should enter the sukkah and immediately say Kiddush. However, one should not make Kiddush before it's absolutely night. And when saying Leishev Basukkah, you should be mindful that when you're making, so just to clarify, Leishev Basukkah means to sit in the sukkah. When he says Leishev Basukkah, he actually means the full blessing, the blessing that goes, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, blessed are you Hashem, our God, King of the world, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvaysav, that has made us holy through his mitzvahs, v'tzivanu, and commanded us Leishev Basukkah, to sit in the sukkah. So the bracha isn't that Hashem has commanded us to eat in the sukkah. Rather, the commandment is that Hashem has commanded us to live in the sukkah, to sit in the sukkah. Therefore, when making that bracha by Kiddush, one should have in mind that this bracha is not just being made on the Kiddush, but it's being made on the whole meal that one is about to eat and on the sleeping. So you're not going to keep making another bracha as you do each of these separate activities. If you're coming home and you're first making Kiddush, and then you're going inside to wash, and then you're saying Hamotzi, and then you're going to sleep, you wouldn't make a separate bracha each time. Rather, you'd make one bracha thanking Hashem for the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, and then that bracha would cover you for whatever tasks that would follow. And other necessities you will do in the sukkah until you say Kiddush again the next morning. And saying Shechiyanu, you should be mindful that this bracha applies to the Yom Tov as well as to the sukkah. So on Shavuos, for example, we say Shechiyanu, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you Hashem, Elokeinu melech ha'olam, our God, King of the world, Shehechiyanu, that you have given us life, Vikimanu, and given us existence. Vihigiyanu, that we reach, and made us reach, Lizman Azeh, this time. This is the bracha we say whenever we're doing something for the first time, or there's a very joyous or exciting occasion. So technically, one should say Shehechiyanu on 2 accounts. One should say Shechiyanu because it's a new Yom Tov, there's Sukkot, and since it's a brand new Yom Tov, we're quite excited. Like even on Yom Kippur, we say Shechiyanu, even though we're not eating or we're not making Kiddush, but it's a new Yom Tov, and out of the greatness of the day, we say Shechiyanu. And on the second count, one says Shechiyanu because there's a special mitzvah of sitting in the Sukkah. So there are 2 mitzvahs here. There's one mitzvah to celebrate the festival of Sukkot, and there's another mitzvah to eat in the Sukkah. And each of these mitzvahs would technically warrant their own bracha. However, we make one bracha of Shechiyanu, and when we say that bracha, we have in mind that it both covers all the different activities that are done in the sukkah, as well as the Yom Tov of Sukkot itself. The first night, but on the second night, you should first say Shechiyanu and then Leishev Sukkah. So this is an interesting idea, difference between the first night and the second night. The first night, we would first say Leishev Sukkah, then Shechiyanu, and the second night, first Shechiyanu, Leishev Sukkah. I'm not going to get into that what now, because I see we've hit 5:20. Please God, I guess tomorrow night is already Sukkot. But over next week, please God, we could continue to learn about all of the different dimensions of the special mitzvah. Thank you so much for joining us, and wishing you a wonderful evening.